Good morning. How is everybody this morning? Welcome. Hopefully you all are warm and cozy. Have a cup of tea or coffee. This morning, good morning, Miss Jennifer. Saw you were coloring and planning your next quilt this morning. Good morning, Miss Wendy. Hello, Miss Lisa. Good morning, Miss Lisa. Yes. Mother Nature did not give me enough snow to keep me home. Oh, thank you, Miss Patty. I know my shirt today has little tiny polar bears on it with little heart noses. Miss Jane, we had maybe 2 inches, maybe. But it was so, it's kind of like shaved ice. It was such big pieces of thin snowflakes that the moment you step on it, it's gone. So it was just, in my world, that's just a dusting. Nothing to keep me home. So the quilt store will be open this morning at regular time. I did push the 10 o'clock in-person class to 11 this morning. I do have some people that may be coming, well, could be coming or should be coming from farther away, that I wanted them to have a moment. Let's the roads get a little more traveled. 301 is clear and pretty much dry. Route 6 was clear, at least from 488 down, and we didn't have any issues. The parking lot looks like nothing happened. So yeah, it is cold and windy. Miss Jennifer, I think most of those designs in the growth chart will fit a 5x7. So yes, everybody can make their assessment and decide if they want to venture out. But our beginner embroidery class will start at 11 this morning for those that are attending. Good morning. So today we are going to start for Breakfast Club the beginning of our basics series. And while I was doing this morning, I'm like, well, I probably should have started with rotary cutting, but I'm just jumping right ahead into seam allowances and squaring up blocks. Maybe I'll throw rotary cutting in there in another month. If anybody needs some assistance with rotary cutting or has questions, please go ahead and comment, put them in here. I will take note and maybe work in another Breakfast Club on rotary cutting techniques. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. So today, like I said, we're going to be talking about squaring up, getting the perfect seam allowance first, and squaring up blocks. Because ultimately, the most important thing about you can have the most perfect, accurate 1/4 inch seam there is in the world, but honestly, if you have not cut accurately, let me put me in here. If you've not cut accurately, it doesn't matter what you sew. Things are not going to be the right size. Good morning, Miss Jessica. Good morning, Miss Connie. Welcome. It won't be the right size. Okay, so it really, those seam allowances and getting square blocks really start all the way back with your rotary cutting, which is when I started developing this the other day. I was like, why did I not do rotary cutting? But sometimes I just don't think all the way through. So let's talk about seam allowance. Okay, are we sewing a perfect 1/4 inch? Are we sewing a scant 1/4 inch? What are we sewing, and what is a scant 1/4? So a perfect 1/4 inch seam is one that measures exactly 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the fiber or the edge of your fabric to the sewn seam. Okay, so from this edge to this edge would be a true 1/4 of an inch, perfect 1/4 of an inch. Now, a scant 1/4 inch is something that was kind of developed way back in the day with quilters and things like that, because when you sew a perfect 1/4 of an inch, now you may be able to sew a perfect 1/4 inch, but when you fold back your fabric, you're not really getting a true 1/4 of an inch fold back. You're actually losing some here, okay? So that's where the scant 1/4 came in. And so a scant 1/4 would be actually sewing about 1 or 2 threads shy of the true 1/4 of an inch. So a scant 1/4 would be just about to the inside of this seam line, okay? You're sewing a little less than a 1/4 in order for you to be able to, when you fold back and iron, get a true 1/4, okay? So when we're talking about quilting and seam allowances and everything along that lines, there's a lot of things that go into account for the math in quilting. You probably took up this hobby not realizing how much math there really was going to be. And if honestly someone had taught me quilting in geometry, I would have probably got it way faster than I would have without it. So in this math, all these things go into account. So yes, a 2.5 inch square plus a 2.5 inch square in a 4-patch situation is going to give you basically 4.5, okay, unfinished. So, but you have to allow, you're going to lose some of your sizing when you fold fabric back and over your thread, okay? So that's where fabric thickness and the thread weights come in handy, or come into play. You also have to be pretty meticulous with your pressing, because if you're not really pulling your fabric all the way back over your seam, so here's my seam, if I'm just, kind of folding it back and I've still got, the lip, or you've got a layer here, you're not getting your full seam allowance, okay, or getting your full seam strip width out of that, because you haven't pressed super accurately either. And when I say press, we're pressing, we're not ironing, okay, because that also throws things off. And then the other thing that comes into play is with your presser foot, okay, and to determining presser feet, where the 1/4 inch seam is on your machine, and things along that lines. So when we talk about fabric weight, your 1/4 inch seam when you sew flannel together is going to be different than when you sew 2 pieces of cotton together, okay? Flannel is thicker, so when we sew it and we fold back over it, there is, let's get that out of the way, more layered or more space needed to come up and over that thread. So if you are going to be piecing with flannel, or really honestly, you should sit down and test your 1/4 of an inch before you do any piecing, because it can be very different between cotton, batik, flannel, anything like that. Doesn't hurt to run a test, because if I did this strip set out of flannel, and I should have done that this morning, and then I do it out of cotton, I'm not going to end up with the same size strip set if I use the same exact positioning on my machine, okay? The other thing that takes up space in your seam allowance is thread, okay? So thicker thread monopolizes more space, right? Same as it is anywhere. You know, a 5-pound bag of sugar is going to occupy more space than a 1-pound bag of sugar. Okay. So that's why I recommend, and most everybody recommends, that you use 50 weight cotton for piecing. And you can even go thinner if you wanted, but 50 weight is the pretty good, strong enough to hold your fabric without breaking, but thin enough to not produce so much bulk in the seam, and that you can get pretty accurate with it. If you don't believe me and don't think that thread makes a difference, try piecing your quilt block or your practice set that I'm going to show you how to do in 30 weight thread, 40 weight thread. They're going to come out, but they're probably not going to come out to the size that they should if you did the math. Okay? If you work in the world of Aurifil, one second. Aurifil thread. Let me get you. Aurifil thread, 50 weight is orange. Okay, the spool is orange. Okay, typically the sticker on the bottom will also say 50. OESD is a 40 weight polyester. Okay, which is fine too, but 40 weight polyester and a 50 weight cotton are pretty close. Okay, that 40 weight is a little thicker. You just need to test if you're going to piece with it. Okay. So yes, orange spools for your 50 weight cotton. And there is also 50 weight can come in a 2-ply. It can also come in a 3-ply. And they can also be slightly different in the way that they feel. Okay? So again, I would test your thread, okay, especially if you're using a brand that you don't normally use, or you know it's all you get your hands on, or it's what you found in your drawers, just to make sure that you are going to get the right seam allowance in it. Green is 40, yes, Miss Jennifer. So if Aurifil thread, here's the breakdown. In Aurifil thread, gray spools are 28 weight. Green spools are 40. Orange spools are 50. 80 weight is on a wooden spool. Okay. And I think the wool thread's also on a gray spool, I believe, as well. But typically in my world, in my store, we have 28 weight on a gray spool, 40 weight on a green spool, and we have the 50 weight on an orange spool. Okay. All right. Let's see. Now, once you have your thread, okay, you have your pressing, and you've got yourself set up in that aspect. We always use same thread on top as we use in the bobbin when we are piecing. Okay, that way we have the same weights. You know, you want to make sure everything's happy. The next thing that we need to look at is your 1/4 inch foot. I did bring my drink over. 1 second. Now, in the world of Bernina, we have 6 possible 1/4 inch feet. I know, that's a lot of 1/4 inch feet. Those 1/4 inch feet are going to depend upon which one you use, is really going to depend upon which Bernina you have, and things like that. Oh. Thank you, Gina. Now, one second. With your 1/4 inch foot, 37, 57, okay, are really meant for 5.5 millimeter stitch width machines, okay? 37D and 57D need to be used on machines that have dual feed, okay? So that's the new generation 5, 7, and 8 series machines, okay? 97 and 97D are the 1/4 inch foot that was created for 9 millimeter feed dogs, okay? So if you, and I will show you when we come over here to the machine actually. Okay, so I'll show you the difference of why I like my 97s for my 9 millimeter machines, okay, and my 37s and 57s for my 5.5 millimeter machines. In other brands, I know you have a patchwork foot. You probably don't have as many options in patchwork feet. But you just need a 1/4 inch foot. If you don't have a 1/4 inch foot, some brands have a stitch on the machine that moves your needle position, okay, to help you achieve 1/4 inch with following the edge of that wider foot, okay? And even with Berninas, if you don't have your 1/4 inch foot with you, you can use your other presser feet and be able to move your needle position to the right in order to achieve 1/4 inch, okay? The one thing that I want to point out on our 1/4 inch feet with the Berninas, okay, is on the side of the feet, on both sides, both the left and right side, there are notches. The middle notch is even with your needle. The back notch is 1/4 inch away from your needle, and the front notch is 1/4 inch in front of your needle. We don't typically use this in typical straight stitch piecing or strip piecing, but when we get to set in seams, needing to start 1/4 inch away from something or stop 1/4 inch away from something, these markings are there to help you not have to mark anything or, get out a ruler or anything along that lines. You have those markings that are built into the presser feet, okay? And that goes to stay on all of these feet. The markings are there. This 57 and the 57D, it is hard to see the markings on the right side of the foot because the 57, the 57D have a built-in guide that is attached to the side of the foot. Okay? Now, let's look at the machine. Okay, for a moment. Pop this off. So I talked about feed dogs, okay, a 9 millimeter feed dog machine, a 5.5 millimeter feed dog machine, and what I'm referring to is the distance between the two feed dogs that are on the machine, okay? One style machine is going to have a 5.5 millimeter difference, and the other will be a 9 millimeter difference, depending upon the machine. This is a 37 foot that I have here right now, okay? If I were to put this on a 9 millimeter machine, like I have right here, I'm gonna put my foot down. Can you see? It's hard to tell, but it is just barely, this foot is just barely riding on feed dogs, okay? It's got a little bit of feed dog right there, and a little bit of feed dog right here, just about 1/8 of an inch. It's very, very small. And so I find with using that 37 or that 57, when I am trying to piece, 2 layers of cotton together on a 9mm machine, very, very difficult. I feel like I'm really fighting to keep my fabric straight. I'm not as accurate when I'm using a regular 37 or 57. If we look at the 97, you can see on the 97 that the left-hand side of the 97 is larger than it was on the 37. So they've expanded the left-hand side of the foot to ride on more feed dog, to give us more traction with our feed dogs. Okay, so I still have the 1/4 of an inch here. Okay, but over on the left-hand side of the foot, I have more traction, because normally we would be piecing, and this is going to be the section that has the most fabric under it anyway, and now we've got more fabric, more feed dog to presser foot coverage. Okay, on your 1/4 of an inch foot, this edge of the foot, no matter which one you have, is going to be the 1/4 of an inch. Okay, let me do one thing here. Let me move my head out of the way so that you can see. It's going to give you the 1/4 of an inch. The true test here, you also have on the Berninas, there is a mark right on the stitch plate that's going to also indicate 1/4 of an inch. If you have your slide-on tray table attached to the machine, you have a engraved line on your slide-on tray table that matches to a 1/4 of an inch. Okay. When you are piecing with a 1/4 of an inch foot, you should not be able to see the edge of the fabric on the outside edge of the foot. Okay? If you can see even the slightest bit of fabric here on the outside of the foot, you are sewing bigger than a 1/4 of an inch. Okay? You're not at a perfect 1/4 of an inch there. Okay? So you want to actually be under the foot or at the very, very, very edge of the foot. Now, for my 97 owners, if you prefer a guide, and that's why you shift to the 57, they came with your 97 foot, is a screw-in seam guide. Okay, so my screw is missing at the moment, but it screws into one of these holes here. It butts right up next to the foot, and it's designed for you to be able to keep your fabric exactly where it's at. Okay, right in line with the edge of the foot. It won't let you go bigger. Okay, this patchwork seam guide is available for any Bernina. Okay, not just to go with this foot. I can change out to any foot, and it's not just meant for my 1/4 inch feet. You could also set this up at 5/8 inch seam allowance or 3/8, and then it's just got you a permanent seam guide so that you know where to follow up next to. Okay, so I hope that makes sense in terms of presser feet and things along that line. Now let's test our 1/4 of an inch. And so anytime I sit down to sew on any machine, okay, because every machine is different, you should do this on any machine, especially if you're going to be sewing a project between multiple different machines, because the 1/4 inch on my 880, it could be slightly different than the 1/4 inch on my Classroom 790. Okay. So you want to test them so that if you make half your blocks here and half your blocks there, they all come out to be the same. You take 3 2.5 inch by I say 6 inches. They could be longer, they could be shorter. You don't want to be much shorter than about 4 inches. You're going to sew them together. You're going to press the seams away from center, and then that middle strip should measure exactly 2 inches. Okay, so I have my 3 2.5 inch strips here that I sewed together. I pressed my seams away from center, and when I press, what I do is before I flip my fabric up, I press my iron on top of the seam that I just sewed. I do what we call setting the seam. This relaxes the fibers of your cotton and kind of allows the cotton thread to become one with it or become part of it. It helps it to set into your fabric, so that again also helps to reduce the bulk as you flip up and back. So I lay it on the ironing board with the fabric that the seam needs to go towards up. Okay, so I'm pressing away from center. That means this fabric needs to be up. I'm going to press my seam to set it, and then I'm going to flip it back, and you'll find if you do pressing, setting that seam, this flip will be much nicer and you won't be fighting it. And then I usually take the side of my iron, we'll pretend my hand's the iron, and I just kind of push back and set down. I lift my iron, I kind of run it over and set it down. I'm just using the edge of the iron to make sure that I am pressed all the way back against that seam that I just sewed. And then I'm going to repeat this on the other side. And when you do that, take a ruler and measure. This strip should be 2 inches from seam to seam. Okay? That means that I have achieved at where my machine was set up at and where I followed my 1/4 inch. So, and this strip unit should measure 6.5 if I were to measure this whole unit here. Okay. It's 6.5 from left to right. Okay. 2 1/4, 2 1/4 plus 2. If it does not match 2 inches, is it big or is it small? Do you need to increase what you're using for seam allowance, or do you need to decrease what you're using for seam allowance? Make the adjustments, sew again. Okay? Now, in terms of adjusting your seam allowance, there is a few things that you could do. Test out your needle position. If you're like, I'm already following the edge of my foot, I can't see my fabric, I know I can't make any more adjustments there. Maybe you just need to move your needle position one little position to the right to help you get that scant 1/4 inch. Okay? Or move it to the left if you're doing too small of a 1/4 inch. Check out your pressing, make sure that you're pressed all the way back, and then make the necessary adjustments until you get the correct size. Do not seam rip this and sew it again. Cut yourself another set of strips and test that. The more you keep seam ripping this, the more this will start to get distorted, and it won't be an accurate 2.5 inch strip anymore. Okay? And then nothing's going to come out to be the measurement that you need it to be. Okay. Now, let's look at squaring up blocks, because this comes into play, and for some people they just skip this step, and that's fine. But you're probably also, those people are also the ones that are very disappointed and frustrated when they lose points. Quilt blocks don't match up, things don't lay flat, things along that lines. So we have to do several steps of squaring things up. First, we square up the individual units. Then we go and put our quilt block together, and then we test and square up the completed block. And then we square up the assembled top once everything's in there. I will discuss at the end of February, at the Breakfast Club at the end of February, how to use borders to help bring your quilt top into being square, and what it will look like if you don't. Now, a lot of you may send your quilts out to long armers and they just don't tell you how we do a lot of things as a long armor. We fix a lot of not straight, not flat quilts, and we do our best to really get them without having to take any puckers, any pleats in it, but sometimes it just happens. So I'm gonna try to teach you. Now again, it's a couple of extra steps, and for some people, it's too much work. And so we want to give you all the tools to help give you success in your quilt top. So that I will talk about in February. But if you are making a 4-patch or a 9-patch square that's got half square triangles in it and solid squares, those half square triangles need to match what you plan to do. So for example, in this block, if I made a bunch of half square triangles and then I had a bunch of these 3.5-inch squares, and I just sewed these and pressed them. I didn't measure them. I just said, okay, I'm going to start sewing. It's a possibility those are either going to be smaller than 3.5 or they could be bigger than 3.5. And then when you go to put them together, you could have points that don't match or things that don't come together. So we need to make sure that before we assemble the block, that the individual units all are the same size. Okay? So, and definitely like this block here, these units needed to be a particular size so that they would fit and match into these units. I was digging through the scrap bins this morning looking for blocks. Okay. So, if I had a 4-patch and I had a triangle and a square, these units need to be the same size, okay, in order for me to be able to sew them together and them match. Otherwise, you'll have things that are taller or shorter and you won't know what to do. Typically, when I am squaring up a 4-patch or a block that has a unit that has a center seam, if I know that this is supposed to be 4.5, that means that this point right here should be 2.25 from here out and 2.25 from here out, and the same up and down. So I could take my ruler, which I lost. Hold on. I could take my ruler. I could put 2.25 on that seam, and I've got 2.25 on this seam and this seam, and then I could trim any excess off the side and across the top. I would then take this block, turn it once, twice, so that my 2 edges that I just trimmed are now on my left and bottom, and I repeat 2.25, 2.25. The other thing that you can double check and you want to make sure is that 4.5 is right along the edge. If you are a lefty, my lefties, you would rotate your ruler, and if you don't have a left-handed ruler, and you would be cutting left and top. Okay. The same would go into squaring up these units. Okay, this is a 4.5-inch triangle in a square. This unit, this is the middle of my unit, right? So if I'm going to square this unit up, my 2.25 should go at that intersection, okay, of where that triangle and a square is. I want to make sure that I have 1/4 inch above that unit so that you can make sure that if that's less than 1/4 of an inch, you're going to lose that point when you go to sew this in. So when I'm squaring things up, I am verifying. This block is a little short. It's hard to see, but it is, which is why it was in the scrap bin. But you can put that at 1/4 of an inch, and then I can trim up. Yes, the Stripology Squared or the Stripology XL ruler is really great for squaring up blocks as well. It's around here somewhere. Let me see. It's on the other side of the table. So yes, you can use the Stripology ruler, and it allows you to cut in the 2 channels, and then you rotate your block and cut the other 2 channels. I don't use steam. Personal preference, I don't use steam. It's up to you. I do use starch. Okay. Now, if I'm squaring up a half square triangle, okay, the key to a half square triangle, and I have a bigger one here, is the location of this diagonal line. Okay. So I'm going to place the diagonal line of a square ruler that goes from corner to corner on that seam. When you're squaring up half square triangle units, this diagonal line or that diagonal seam needs to stay in the corner. If I were to trim this up like this, and my seam is here and this is where my corner is, when I go to sew this in the square, that point is going to be down here and it's not going to be correct. Okay, so I'm going to square this up to a, let's just say a 7-inch square. So I'm going to match my diagonal line. I'm going to come over here to the side, and I want to make sure that I have, if I do this, fabric either at 7 inches or more, and I will cut up the side and across the top. If I had a rotary cutter, I would. Across the top. That rotary cutter needs a new blade. Now I'm going to take my block, I'm going to turn it once and twice. Again, leaving the diagonal line of the ruler directly in the center. I have 7-inch lined up directly on the bottom of my fabric, and I have 7-inch on this side. Get that fixed. I'm going to cut up and cut across. Now I have a perfectly square 7-inch block where the diagonal line goes corner to corner. Now if I were to sew this into a unit, it will look like this, and when I sew above and below it, I will have exact points leading into my corners. Okay? I'd square up units that look like this the same way. Okay, using that same diagonal line. You've got to keep the diagonal in corner to corner, and even in a quarter square triangle. Okay. Now, let's look at, now that you've got your units, let's look at how to square up blocks that are too big, which we just did with our square ruler. Okay, too big is always better than too small. Okay. So the question is, when working with blocks like half square triangles, do you make them bigger and trim? Okay, some patterns want the blocks to come out the exact size. Here's my answer. Yes, if you have the fabric to be able to make your unit slightly bigger, do so. I don't cut 7/8, okay? In quilt math, for half square triangles, you take what you want your finished size to be. So if I want a 4-inch square, half square triangle square, once it's all sewn in, I would cut 4 7/8, so down the center on both sides and trim, okay? You are probably going to get a square that's too small, honestly, unless you are sewing exact and you are pressing exact. It is very unlikely that you're going to always get a perfect 4.5-inch square using that method, because a lot of us don't cut super accurately with that 7/8 of an inch. So if a pattern tells me to cut 4 7/8 and then cut 4 7/8 inch squares, I'm going to cut 5. Okay? 7/8 is not a nice number. I just don't like it. I don't like it on the ruler. I don't like cutting it. I'd much rather end up with a square, a half square triangle unit that is 1/8 of an inch bigger that I have to cut down than to have to make them. I can't make fabric bigger. I can't take something that's too small and make it bigger. It just doesn't happen. There are a lot of rulers out there in the world. Studio 180, Quilt in a Day. They all have rulers that make things, take methods of making these units, like half square triangles with the Tucker trimmer, flying geese with the Studio 180 wing clipper. Eleanor Byrne has her flying geese unit. Creative Grids has their units and their rulers. And 90% of them, I believe, are making them bigger and then trimming them down. Okay? But you kind of, Block Lock, thank you, Miss Gina, is another one that's out there that have you make them slightly larger and then they're squaring them down to be super accurate. Most pattern designers are going to allow you that little bit of extra fabric. I know Quilt in a Day does. Miss Eleanor gives you a lot of fabric. But there are some others that are pretty exact. So you may want to do some rough quilt math at looking at, okay, they want me to cut 14 of these squares and this is the amount of yardage I have for it. Just make sure that you can get your slightly bigger squares out of that. And especially with the Tucker trimmer uses a completely different method, or not the Tucker trimmer, the wing clipper uses a completely different method for making flying geese. So they're using larger squares and then trimming down. And then, your yardage may not allow you to cut a big square and then 2 smaller squares, and it's really based on you cutting that rectangle and folding that corner. Okay? So yes, cutting bigger and then using that scant quarter and then trimming down. Most of us all trim down, but some people don't trim down. They just say, oh, it's a square. I'm just moving forward. And then they want to know why things don't match. Okay. Now, the big question is, how do I do this? Okay. Now, when things are too small, like I said, you can't make them bigger. There's just no way. The only way to make them bigger is to start over. And again, sometimes you're over it. Sometimes you don't have any more fabric, okay, that you can make it bigger with or make it over with. So there's a couple of things that I do. One, I starch. If I have my quilt block, hold on one second, let's change cameras. Okay, one second. If I have my quilt block, or first thing you do is you take your quilt blocks, you get them all made, and you measure them all. You need to find out what size all those squares are, and you need to get them all to be the same size. Because if I had all of these squares, and some of you that have been with me a while, you may recognize this quilt. Mine's still not done. If I have squares that measure 12 and a half and squares that measure 12 and a quarter and squares that are 12 inches, trying to take these squares and put them together, things are not going to match. I'm going to work really hard to make things match. Okay? So we figure out your measurement as to what your blocks need to be. If my blocks need to be 12 and a half, and I have some blocks that are 12 and a half kind of one way and maybe a little short on the other, I will go visit my ironing board with some Best Press, some Quilter's pressing spray, some Niagara, and I will starch. Spray, let the starch, Best Press, kind of soak in, and then I start pressing, making sure that my seams and everything are really, really flat. You would be surprised that how much a little bit of starch and a little bit of concentrated pressing will give you. You don't want to iron and you don't want to pull, because we don't want this to be stretched wrong. We just want to make sure that we've got as much of everything pulled out to where we need it to be. Okay? So I start with some starch. If your block is, like I say, if things are like, I need it to be 12 and a half, and I have a section like it's 12 and a half here, it's 12 and a half here, and just here at this unit, at this point, it just dips in a little less than 12 and a half. It's still within my seam allowance. I can sew my 1/4 of an inch seam here, and just this little section may be a little less than 1/4 of an inch. Okay? One piece of fabric will be at the true 1/4, and this will be a little bit. Okay? Now, I have another method, and that's using freezer paper. Okay? So, you take freezer paper, you cut freezer paper. This is just regular old kitchen freezer paper, nothing fancy here. Cut freezer paper to the size that your square needs to be. So 12 and a half. I'm going to come on the back of on the paper side of the dull side of the freezer paper, I'm going to mark in my seam allowance, 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to fold my freezer paper in half and just just crease it so that I know where center is. You can even fold it diagonally. I think you can see pretty well here. Folding it in ways that you can use to align with your block. Okay? So I took that piece of freezer paper that was folded. I kind of folded my block and I ironed here, and then I opened that up and I matched that, and then I ironed here so that I had an ironed crosshair. Okay. I took the shiny side of the freezer paper and put it towards the wrong side of my quilt block. I aligned my creases and I ironed this in place. The shiny side of freezer paper will iron to your fabric but still be removable. Okay? What I've done is I've just secured my quilt block to that freezer paper, and now I could go and sew my 1/4 of an inch using the edge of the freezer paper as my edge of my block. I think you can see. You see how I'm just a hair shy right there at that point? This bottom corner here is just a hair shy. So I can sew. I could put my blocks together, right sides together. I could come through here. You can tell I haven't squared that block down yet. And I could sew on my 1/4 of an inch. I would normally make my stitch length slightly smaller when I'm doing freezer paper. Once my quilt top is together, I'll come in and I'll rip this freezer paper off. Carefully rip it off. Okay? That will give you the stability to be able to piece those blocks that are, you know, maybe slightly wonky on the seams, and things like that. Okay, does that make sense? Miss Indy, I found Best Press made my fabric shrink. Well, did you use steam in addition to Best Press? Because part of the reason why I don't use steam. Steam can cause fabric to shrink, and so can any liquid that you spray on non-washed fabric, can cause that to pull up some. I don't know if I have any knitters or cross stitchers here, or where we block knitting, or you block cross stitch to make sure it's square. You can do the same thing with your quilt blocks. So you can take on your ironing board, you can pin, I usually put some straight pins in my block, and then I'll starch a little section and iron, put some pins in that to hold it in place, and then, you know, iron the next section, and then leave it pinned to the ironing board while it cools. Okay? That will also help. I've done it to entire quilts as well. You have to have a lot of space for it, and it's obviously not on an ironing board, but I have been known to, we had a quilt, I had a customer who had a quilt that didn't lay flat, and it was not something, in the long armors, me and another long armor, there was just no way that we were going to be able to work out that issue without having to take some very noticeable puckers and pleats in the quilt. So I removed the borders from the quilt to come back just to the center of the quilt, and then I wet the entire quilt. I laid it out on the floor. I wet it with a spray bottle, okay, but I dampened it. I laid it out on the floor, and I started pinning to my carpet using a tape measure, pinning, pulling out, taping, and pinning. Pull out, tape, and pin, and then I let it sit there for days to dry. Okay, so ultimately what I was doing was stretching certain sections to be able to, the problem is like the top of the quilt was, let's say, 40 inches wide, and as we went down in the quilt got to be 42 inches wide. Well, that 2 inches as you're quilting a quilt can make a difference, especially if it's 42 at the top and it's 40 at the bottom. So blocking it to try to get it to come out and dry that way, so that I could then go back and put borders on in the technique that I'm going to teach you in February. Okay? So, yes, doing quilt blocks, squaring up your quilt blocks and things along that lines are going to help you be able to achieve those good points and things along that lines. I had a question about what rulers do I prefer. Okay, I am a Creative Grids girl when it comes to my standard rulers. Okay, I like my Creative Grids, one, because they are, let me see if I can get a piece of paper here. They are, so that you can see, printed in black and white. Okay, so you can see it on dark, you can see it on light. They are built-in grip that's in them, okay, as well. They come in a variety of sizes. They come in, they just don't slip on me. I think they are probably my most accurate. They're easiest for me to read the markings that are on it. In terms of specialty rulers, I like Studio 180 I use the Tucker trimmer and the wing clipper are the two rulers that I love the most for squaring up and making and squaring up half square triangles and flying geese. She's also got some pretty, the Hunter Star ruler, the Lemoyne Star ruler. She has some really cool technique rulers for making some more difficult blocks in an easier method. That's there, but a majority of my rulers are Creative Grids now in this world. The other thing about accuracy is that if you start cutting a project with a ruler, you need to use that ruler the entire way through, okay? Because the accuracy between using this ruler and then switching over to something like this, they may not be exact, okay? And the same with a mat. Mats, from one mat to the other, they may not be super exact. So whatever you start a project with, you should finish a project with. Okay? Well, I think I have talked absolutely too much this morning. Oh, hush. But I hope that has helped. Oh, the other little thing that you can use, let me change cameras real fast. If you have one of these, yes, Miss Vicky, that's the reason why I've shifted to away from, this used to be my ruler of choice, OmniGrid, but it is hard to see in this, and that's why we've shifted everything. The only rulers I carry, standard rulers I carry in my store are Creative Grids. Good morning, Miss Vanita. The other thing I want to show you real fast, if you are struggling to find your 1/4 inch, this is a perfect piecing seam guide. And so what this little guy is he's got a hole drilled in him that you want to take and put your needle down in using your hand wheel. Don't step on the gas, okay? And then I'm going to lower my presser foot, okay? And I can see exactly at the edge of this ruler is where my 1/4 inch is. If you don't have a 1/4 inch foot, you don't have a seam guide, you can use some tape to mark this. So this here is just a piece of washi tape. If you don't know what washi tape is, you can get it at, well, you get it at Target now. It's like paper tape. It's not overly sticky, and you can use that to mark, don't cover your feed dogs, but use that to also give you a visual. The other thing that you can use to give yourself a seam guide is grab yourself a stack of Post-it notes. Take about, about a 1/4 inch, but that right up next to that ruler, and there is your, there's your seam guide. Okay, and that you can use to keep you nice and straight. Okay. Okay. So Miss Elisa has a question, and I do want to answer it.
And you're still talking.
I am still talking, yes. But somebody asked a question. What? When you are cutting and lining up the edge, is the line on your ruler to cut on top of the fabric or besides the fabric? You want your ruler right on the edge. You don't want it next to, but you want it right on top of. Okay? So if I were to line this up here, I want that right on top of. I don't want it next to, but right on top of it. So that's the other reason why I like the Creative Grids, is it's got a thinner line. So you can be a little more, you can tell a little bit more if you are past the line or short of the line. Whereas it can be a little more challenging with these rulers to know exactly where you're located at. But yes, you want that line right on top of the cut edge that you have. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining me here this morning. I will be back on February 9th, I believe. No, February 12th. Yeah, February 12th is the Bernina foot video. We will discuss the foot of the month for Bernina for February, which is foot number 74. And then we will return on the 26th of February to talk about how to put borders on a quilt and to keep the quilt top square and to make your long armor very happy. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Stay warm, stay safe, and we will see you here soon.